Welcome back to the Recalcitrant DBA. If you've been with us for the first three videos, you've installed SQL Server, SQL Management Studio, you've added a sample database named AdventureWorks, and you've taken a quick tour of that Management Studio. If you haven't already, I strongly recommend that you go back and watch them, those first three videos. This is a series, and each video builds upon the previous one. I don't want you to miss out or get confused. So you've taken that tour of the Management Studio, and now we're ready to start writing queries. In fact, you did write a couple, but you probably didn't really know what they did. So we're going to take the next few videos and talk about the queries that read data from the database using our first command, select. So if you don't have Management Studio already open, go ahead and get it open, connect to it as usual, and then create a new query window like we talked about in the last video. So you'll see that we're focused on the master database, and we want to use AdventureWorks. So you could, from this drop-down window, just choose AdventureWorks. But the problem with that is when you save this query, and let's say you open it up again later, it will be focused on, it may or may not be focused on AdventureWorks. We'd like that use AdventureWorks part to be in the script itself. So that's a best practice. So to do that, you simply come in here and type use AdventureWorks. Now, as we talked about in the last video, it's not case sensitive. I tend to do an uppercase for the first letter on commands, but that's purely my style. You can do whatever you want. You can do all upper, all lower, some mixed, whatever. SQL Server doesn't care. It's nice to keep them neat and clean, and most importantly, consistent. If you can exercise consistency in your code, you'll be much better off. All right, once again, we're going to end this line with a semicolon, and we'll follow it with a go. So let's execute this. And you'll see the command completed successfully, and up here we are focused on AdventureWorks. So let's go back to that same query that we were working with in the last video. And by the way, when I'm doing these queries and typing this stuff in, anytime you're a little bit behind, just pause the video and catch up. So here's that last query we worked with. Select star from human resources, and again I'm going to use the IntelliSense here. Just hit the tab key, dot department, and end with a semicolon. So there are two major parts to this query here. The first part here is that select star. And the last part is that from part. Let's talk about the select star for a second. What we're directing SQL Server to do with select star is to read, that is, select all of the columns in the table. So the star means all. We're directing SQL to give us all of the columns. And by saying star, that's what we're doing, but we can modify that and see only certain columns. This part, select star, is called the select clause. It gets a little picky sometimes, once in a while, to worry about that too much, but for sake of discussing it in these videos, let me refer to that as the select clause. Now, Select will always stay the same. The star is going to change. We'll get to that in a minute. Second part here is from human resources department. This from clause is where we tell SQL Server what table we want to read from. By the way, it isn't only tables that we're going to read from, but for now, let's keep it simple and keep it that way. Commonly, because these are two different clauses, people will write these on two separate lines, like that. SQL Server is both case insensitive and white space insensitive. Let me explain those. What I mean by case insensitive, we've already talked about a couple of times. We mean that you can write the commands like select and from in either uppercase, lowercase, mixed case, anything you want. SQL Server won't be confused. And as I mentioned just a minute ago, you really should set a standard for yourself and stick to it. Because later on, debugging your code and making corrections will be a lot easier if you can visually see what you've done. And mistakes will stand out that way. So I'd recommend you pick one, stick with it. I think what I'm doing here, uppercase as the first letter and the rest lowercase, is pretty common to do, but whatever you'd like. So that's what I mean by case insensitive. White space insensitive, I mean that I don't care if there is one space between the word from and human resources department, or 27 spaces, or a tab, a bunch of tab spaces, or a carriage return line feed. It doesn't care. It's looking for that semicolon. And that's how it's going to know that it's at the end of a line. So let me kind of set this back to normal, what I had it at before. So white space insensitive simply means that I can put these on separate lines. I could put the select on one line, the star on another, the from on another, etc. You couldn't put FRO on one line and then M on the next line. You'll notice that it gets a little squiggly line. And that's simply telling you, no, something's wrong there. So you can't break up a word. But anywhere that you can put a space, you can put any white space you would like. So in general, let's look at this query again. We're telling SQL Server to show us all of the columns that exist in this table. We're also telling it to show us all the records. Now we'll get into, in the next video, how to filter that query so it only returns some of the records. But for now, we're going to leave it the way it is. All right, that star in the select statement, again, represents all of the columns. But if you think about it, SQL Server has to do several different steps in order to figure out what those columns actually are. And because of that, your query runs a little bit slower. Well, admittedly, we're talking here about nanoseconds, so it's not a big deal. But if you run that query and it takes a few more nanoseconds each time, and you multiply that by the hundreds and thousands of times that your query might be running, it starts to add up. So we prefer not to use that star. Instead, we're going to try to do work for SQL Server by writing our queries smart and let SQL Server then know exactly what columns we want, because we're going to list them by name. So let's modify our code a little bit. I'm going to erase that star, and I'm going to type in the names of the columns. So there are 3 columns I'm interested in here. So I'm going to select name, and notice as I start typing, IntelliSense once again kicks in and I can hit tab. And I'm going to separate each of those columns with a comma. So I'll say name and group name and modified date. So I'm going to select those 3 columns from the table, and now I'm telling SQL Server specifically what I want. When I execute this code, I get back just those 3 columns. One thing I like to do when I'm retrieving lots of columns is to put each column on its own line in my code. And I do it like this. I put the first column right behind the select, and then on the next line, and indented so it lines up with the first column, I put the second one. And then I do the same thing with the third column and the fourth and the fifth, etc. You'll notice that I am putting the comma on the very next line. This comma, logically, we kind of tend to think of it as going after the word name. But by putting that comma on the next line, because SQL is white space insensitive, it doesn't care. And I find it much easier to detect a missing comma this way. If they're on the right side after the word, they're you see the names are different lengths and they're staggered around. By putting it on the next line, they're all lined up in a row, and it's quite easy to spot anything that's missing or out of order that way. Once again, just my habit, but you can do what you'd like. Also, laying them out this way is going to make it easier to do what I'm about to show you. So those column names are created for ease of use in the table and database, but they don't always make sense to people looking at them. I once saw a database where the tables were named Table 1, Table 2, etc., and the columns were called Column 1, Column 2, Column 3, Column 4, and so on. Not real helpful. And when we want to view this data in a report like this, it's nice to have these column names, like they show up down here, in a format that makes sense to human beings. So I'm going to erase this query, and let's start with a different one. I am going to select name, and then again I'll go to the next line, and comma, standard cost, comma, list price, comma, safety stock level, and make flag. Now notice all the times I'm having to go in here and make changes and typing and all that kind of thing. And it's because IntelliSense can't help me, because IntelliSense doesn't know what table I'm going to read from. So let's do this again, and I'm going to show you a little trick. I'm going to write the word select, and then I'm going to go ahead and go to the next line. And I'm going to tell it what I'm going to select from. And I'm going to select from a table called production dot product. Okay, The squiggly line is showing up here telling me there's incorrect syntax because it wants to know what I'm going to read. But now, because IntelliSense knows what table I'm going to use, it can now start to help me with those column names. So now let's do this again and make it a little bit easier on ourselves. So now when I type standard cost, I just type a couple of the letters and it can help me. Say with list price, a couple of letters, and IntelliSense, and I don't have to worry about making mistakes in spelling and things like that, typos. So if I type safety stock level and then make flag, and it's all done. So now I've got, let's execute this. And you get all the correct values. Everything's technically correct here. But if you look at this, this can be a bit confusing. What is standard cost? What is safety stock level? What is make flag? We can, in our code, give those column names nicknames, or we call them aliases. So they work like this. I'm going to say select name, and then I'm going to use the word as. And I'm going to give it an alias of product name. Oops. Now, great. I made a mistake and it's perfect timing because I wanted to show you that in T-SQL we use single quotes, not double quotes. And I've got a double quote here, and so it's showing me an error. I'm going to convert that to a single, and my error goes away. So remember that when we're dealing with anything that has spaces in it, like product space name, SQL Server needs us to put that in quotes, and we use single quotes. I can alias standard cost as cost. Since it's a single word, no spaces, I don't need quotes. It wouldn't hurt to put them in. It's no problem, but there's no need to either. Same thing on this next line. I'm going to alias this as price. And I'm going to alias the safety stock level as, and I'll put this in quotes, the number to keep in stock. Missed a letter here. Let me put that in. And finally, I'll alias make flag as do I need to make more? You even put a question mark in there. I don't like question marks and things like that, but sometimes it'll help clarify it. You can put that in or leave it out as you like. Now, all these aliases do is help clarify the output. They don't change anything internal into the table. In fact, there's nothing you can do in a select statement that's going to change that. So our column names in the table itself aren't going to change, but the output is going to change from like standard cost, list price, safety, stock level to make flag to something a little more easy and more clear to read, like so. Okay, that's been fun. And you're starting to really make queries with the select statement. These are very real queries. Let's review what you've learned so far this lesson. You learned how to use the use statement to focus your query on a particular database. You learned how to use two of the clauses in the select statement. the select list, and the from clause. And by the way, those are the only two required clauses. You must have something in your select list and you must have something in your from clause. There are other clauses that we're going to investigate in the next few videos, but you've learned how to use the two essential clauses. You've started formatting your code. So you've learned you can put them on other lines. You've learned that you can format the case of a word or a command or whatever you want. You've learned how to separate the commas out. So you're starting to learn formatting, and we'll again do more as we go. And finally, you learned how to use aliases, such as cost for standard cost. You just simply put in the as and then the name, then the alias. You've learned that. In the next video, we'll begin to explore how to filter your rows using the where clause. Until then, practice writing your own queries. Remember, you can't hurt the database by giving a select statement. So try anything you want. Give it a shot. If it works, it works. If you get an error, you might be able to understand what that error is. You might not. That's right. But just practice writing the queries until select starts to feel natural. Lastly, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so that when the next video comes out, you'll know about it. It'll help you as you progress through these videos to be regular in doing them. All right, well, have fun. Enjoy your T-SQL querying, and I'll see you in the next session of the Recalcitrant DBA.